So let's look at just one example, and this would be Matthew 13, 3 to 23. And so this is what that passage would look like. You can see in the context, you had the religious leaders and Jews in general rejecting Jesus. You had that day connects to chapter 12. You have the disciples and large crowds following Jesus. You have the interpretation and explanation of the parable in verses 18 to 23. And so that really is going to help us out a great deal. And then, of course, the point of the passage, everyone must have the appropriate response to Jesus' words in order to enter the kingdom. And, of course, so in the middle column, where it's the earthly story about the sower, you have a list of items under that: sower, the seed, roadside soil, birds, rocky, thin soil, the sun, soil, and thorns, and so forth. But the good news with this passage is that Jesus gives us the interpretation of the passage. And so that becomes a very, very important. And then, of course, in the third column, you write down the heavenly meaning or your interpretation. Okay? And so, again, this is how you would take the information. You go through your 5 C's, 5 C's being content, construction, context, culture, category. You're going to look at each one of these you're going to list in your earthly story, and you're going to look at each one of these in light of the context, and then, of course, put down your heavenly meaning or your interpretation of each one. Okay? Now, sometimes you will run across parables that have multiple parables back to back. And when that happens, is usually some kind of connection between the parables or some kind of commonality that you will find with the parables. And we see that with Luke chapter 15. Luke chapter 15. So in Luke chapter 15, if we turn over there, what we find is Jesus with tax collectors and sinners who are considered the bottom of the barrel of the social totem pole, and they are having fellowship with Jesus. And of course, the religious leaders complain about it. And so that becomes very important in understanding why Jesus gave the parable. And so, turn over to Luke chapter 15, and we'll read a snippet of that, and then we'll take a look at that particular, how that chart can be developed. So now all the tax collectors and sinners were coming near him to listen to him. So you have the tax collectors and sinners coming to listen to Jesus. They want to hear his message. And so Jesus is willing to give them that message. And so he says, both the Pharisees and the scribes began to grumble, saying, this man receives sinners and eats with them. And so instead of them welcoming the tax collectors and sinners, they're complaining that Jesus is spending time with them. And so verse 3, it says, so he told this parable saying, so right there you can see that the reason why he told the parable was because the religious leaders, Pharisees and scribes, were complaining that he was spending time with sinners and tax collectors. And so he responded with 3 different parables. The first parable is the lost sheep. He says, what man among you, if he has it has 100 sheep and has lost one of them, does not leave the 99 in the open pasture and go after the one which is lost until he finds it. When he has found it, he lays it on his shoulder, rejoicing. And when he comes home, he calls together his friends and his neighbors, saying to them, "Rejoice with me, for I have found my sheep which was lost." And I tell you that in the same way, there will be more joy in heaven over one sinner who repents than over 99 righteous persons who need no repentance. And so he gives the explanation. He gives the parable from 4 to 6, and then he gives the explanation in 7 as to what the parable is about. So he helps to give you an interpretation, if you will, of the parable. Now, one of the important things that you'll have to understand, ladies and gentlemen, when you're dealing with these parables, is that you're going to have to know when the parable starts and when the parable ends. It's real important. You got to be able to determine when does the parable start and when does the parable end. Verse 8, or what woman, if she has 10 silver coins and loses one coin, does not light a lamp and sweep the house and search carefully until she finds it? And when she has found it, she calls together her friends and neighbors, saying, "Rejoice with me, for I have found the coin which I had lost." And so you have something, you have the sheep lost in the first parable. Now you have the coin that's lost in the second parable. Now, in both, the ownership rights, or the connection, if you will, of both the sheep and the coin never changed. Of course, the sheep belonged to the man and the coin belonged to the wife, and that relationship never changed. It was always the same type of relationship. It's just that one, the item either was lost, misplaced, but the relationship over them never changed. Verse 10, in the same way, I tell you, there is joy in the presence of the angels of God over one sinner who repents. And so again, it's a very, very similar explanation that we saw in verse 7, where, he calls his friends and neighbors and they rejoice because the coin was found. You see the same thing with regard to the sheep. He contacts his friends and neighbors and rejoice, and they're excited because they found the sheep. Then the last section is what we call the third parable in this trilogy of parables. So he says, and he said, a man had 2 sons. The younger of them said to his father, "Father, give me the share of the estate that falls to me." So he divided his wealth between them. And so remember, in the ancient days, the eldest son got a double portion, and so he would get 2/3, and the younger son or the rest of the family would get 1/3. And so, and of course, they would divide up the estate at the death of the testator. Of course, that's when a will speaks, is at the death of a testator. And so here, the father is being gracious enough to divide the estate even before his death. And he divides it up between them, meaning both the elder son and the younger son. So in this particular case, the elder son was involved. And not many days later, the younger son gathered everything together and went on a journey into a distant country. And there he squandered his estate with loose living. Now, when he had spent everything, a severe famine occurred in that country, and he began to be impoverished. So now the younger son that took his inheritance squandered it, and a famine has hit, and he's in trouble. So when he so he hired himself out to one of the citizens of that country, and he sent him into his field to feed swine. Of course, swine was an unclean animal, and so now he's dealing with an unclean situation. And he would have gladly filled his stomach with the pods that the swine were eating, and no one was giving anything to him. But when he came to his senses, he said, "How many of my father's hired men have more than enough bread, but I am dying here with hunger?" Now remember, we've been dealing with figures of speech, and so here he says, the text says he came to his senses, and that's a metaphor for him realizing his difficult situation and moving him towards repentance, if you will. And so he goes on to say in verse 18, "I will get up and go to my father and will say to him, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight." And so, of course, he now is talking about how he's going to return and repent. 19, "And I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired men." So he got up, came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion for him, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And this particular passage kind of reminds me of when my son went away to college. And my son wanted to go to school in New York. And I had basically told him, wherever you want to go, we'll support you. And his mom didn't want him to leave the state. His mom wanted him to go nearby. And so she finally agreed. She relented, about moms and sons. And so she finally relented and allowed him to go. And so he went away. And it was a tough moment because he and I have always been so close. He's the youngest son and my namesake. And so when he went away, everybody, we had a celebration to send him off. But after he was gone, we were experiencing the loss of his presence. And I remember the first year, when we put him on the plane, I was walking back and it started hitting me, actually, even before we got to the car. And tears started rolling down my face. And everybody was trying to console me. And I just basically told them, hey, leave me alone. That's my child. Now, of course, my wife is looking at me like, why are you crying? You said he could go, But he was gone, and we were in support of that, but it didn't take away the loss of his presence. And so he finally came back home for Thanksgiving, and he flew in to Intercontinental, and we went out there to meet him. And this was the time when you could actually go right up to the gate and be there waiting for him. And we were there sitting, and when he came out of the airplane onto within the terminal, I ran and grabbed him and hugged him and kissed him on the forehead and the top of his head. And we celebrated the fact that he had returned. And now he was gone not because of a situation like the wasteful son in this particular parable, but he was gone. And the love that I felt and showered with him to see him come back, how much more I could see in this particular parable that this father didn't know if the son would ever come back. And so it appears that this father was on the lookout for his son. It says, so he got up, verse 20, and came to his father, but while he was still a long way off, his father saw him, felt compassion for him, and ran and embraced him and kissed him. And so you could you could see or feel, if you will, the Father's loving acceptance of him returning back to the fold, so to speak. And the Son said to the Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight, and I am no longer worthy to be called your son. But the Father said to his slave, quickly bring out the best robe and put it on him, and put a ring on his hand and sandals on his feet. And bring the fatted calf, kill it, and let us eat and celebrate. For this son of mine was dead and has come to life again. He was lost and has been found. And they began to celebrate. And so they're having a big feast and a big party. Unfortunately, the parable, or fortunately, but the parable doesn't end there. Because remember, there's an elder son hanging out there. And it says, now his older son was in the field, and when he came and approached the house, he heard music and dancing. Now, I'd have to say, ladies and gentlemen, that was a sure enough party when you can hear dancing. He not only heard the music, but he heard them dancing. And so they must have been really celebrating that the son had returned. Goes on to say, and he summoned one of the servants and began inquiring what these things could be. And he said to him, your brother has come, and your father has killed the fatted calf, because he has received him back safe and sound. And so the son was restored back into fellowship with the Father. But he became angry and was not willing to go up in, or willing to go in. And his father came out and began pleading with him. So the father is showing the elder son love just like he showed the younger son. But the elder son is having a problem with this. But he answered and said to his father, look, for so many years I have been serving you, and I have never neglected a command of yours, yet you have never given me a young goat so that I might celebrate with my friends. So he said that he didn't give him a goat that he could celebrate, but he never stopped him from celebrating or inviting his friends either. He had the ability to throw his own party with his father's money and his father's goods, so to speak. Because look at what the father said. He says, but when this son of yours came, who has devoured your wealth and prostitutes, you killed the fatted calf for him. And he said to him, son, this is the father talking now, you have always been with me, and all that is mine is yours. Wow. So he always had that available to him. He just chose not to take advantage of it. And in some ways he did take advantage of it, because he got a chance to eat, sleep under his father's roof. He goes on, the text goes on to say, but we had to celebrate and rejoice, for his brother, for this brother of yours was dead and has begun to live, and was lost and has been found. And so again, you have these back-to-back trilogy of parables, if you will. Now, when you analyze parables such as this, you're going to do the same 3-column chart. The only difference is between column 1 and column 2, there's going to be, we'll just call it a 1A. A 1A section that will go in between column 1 and column 2. All right. So now you'll have 1, 2, 3, 4 columns. And this section, since you don't have one story, you have 3 stories. And so you have to divide it up like that. So let's take a look at, let's see if I can change it a little bit so that you can have a better understanding. So again, you're going to have column 1. Then you're going to have column 1A. Then you're going to have column 2. And then you're going to have column 3. Okay? Now remember, we said that column 1 was context. No change there. All right? Here's the change though. Column 2, or 1A I should say, is what we call commonality. Things that tie these particular parables together. All right? What's similar between them? Okay? Column 2 is the earthly story still, which is the parable. But the difference is you have 3. So you got A, B, and C. So this would be the lost sheep, lost coin, and the, I'll just call him the prodigal son, or the wasteful son. All right? So that's how that would look. And then, of course, over here, you still would have your heavenly meaning. Or your interpretation. Okay? So that's how your chart would look. So you got column 1, 1A, 2, and 3, and you put the information in each one of those columns as you go through your 5 C's. The content, construction, context, culture, and the categories. All right? So let's see what this particular chart looks like. All right, now that's a little, might be an eye test for you, but that's about as big as I can get because of the great amount of information. But you can see that in column 1, you still have the context. Column 2, you have the commonalities. In the middle, I have the 3 stories, all right? The missing sheep, the missing coin, the missing son. And then, of course, in the last section, I have the heavenly meaning. So with the trilogy of parables, you're doing the exact same thing, but now you're looking at the commonalities. So as we look through the commonalities, when you get ready to come up with your heavenly meaning, let's say you have 5 things. All right. You're going to have your commonalities for each one of these. All right. And so you're going to take these. Now you're going to drag them through this and the context before you come up with your heavenly meaning. Okay, see how that works? So now you're going to look at your story, then you're going to look at the commonalities between the stories, go back to your context, and then, of course, put down this into your heavenly meaning. So if you have 5 items or 5 elements in your earthly stories, you need to have 5 elements in your heavenly meaning. All right, and that's where you would get each one of those. Okay, so just keep that in mind, that instead of just having the context to determine in light of your heavenly meaning, now you're going to do not only the context, but also you're looking at the commonalities between all 3 of the parables. And so if we go down on my chart, let's just say in every one something is missing. You also have something or someone of value. You have something not missing. Of course, in the first one, you have 99 that were not missing. You had 9 silver coins that were not missing. And then you had the elder son that remained at home. You have something found, 1 lost sheep, or 1 missing sheep, 1 missing coin, and then a younger son. And so again, you're looking at each one of those. Now, the key is the first 2 shed some light on each one of those parables, because Jesus gives an interpretation at the very end of the parable. And so one of the most important things that you're going to do as you look at these parables is, 1, know when they start, and 2, know when they stop. And so once you see where they stop, many times right after they stop, he will begin to give you an interpretation. And of course, that's going to help you as you begin to come up with your heavenly meaning. And so we're going to pause right here and allow you to just kind of absorb some of the information that we have shared. And then I'll show you a few more examples. All right.